What's going on, guys? Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Amigos Code. In this video, I want to talk to you about the N-tier architecture. So this is something that I use quite a lot on my videos, courses, and I get people questioning the architecture, saying what was the name of the architecture that you used. And so I decided to make a video just to make sure that when you build software that can scale. You build software where it doesn't suffer from data integrity. You build software that is easily reusable. So you have components that you can reuse throughout your code base, and secure applications as well. So the N-tier architecture, basically, it's an architecture which is used throughout the industry, mainly for enterprise applications, and it's a way of you separating your code into layers. So what I want to show you first is basically the architecture itself, but then I'm going to show you some actual code and how you translate all of this, and also how do you test, right? Because now you've structured things into different layers, but what is the best way of you testing all of this? Before I explain the N-tier architecture, I just want to mention that I'm about to release the most popular course on my website, and that is the full stack, where a bunch of students managed to get jobs. So I decided to revamp the entire thing, where now it's over 40 hours. So you're going to learn about the backend, you're going to learn about SQL, JDBC, DevOps, AWS, front end with React, automations with GitHub Actions, testing, so focusing a lot on testing, unit testing, integration testing, mocking, all of that stuff without compromising anything, and also TypeScript and Angular. So yes, both TypeScript and Angular, and you can see the actual working application in here. So this is basically with the login, and we have registration, protected routes, and the whole shebang. So if you haven't joined the waiting list, go ahead and do so, because I'm going to get a coupon for those that have registered. And I'm so excited for this course, because it's a course where I can guarantee you that it will take you a long way in your career. So let's learn about the N-tier architecture. So let's begin with the presentational layer. And just to bear in mind, so sometimes you'll see 1 tier, 2 tier, 3 tiers, 4 tiers, hence the name N-tier architecture. So in our case, this is a 3-layer where we have the presentation layer, and this often can be your UI written in React or Angular or any other framework that you have, or it could be a RESTful API, right? So in our case, API v1 / and then customers, for example. Now this layer right here basically is a main entry point to your application, right? So it takes the request that comes from the clients, and that's all it does, right? Then it forwards the request to the business layer, where the business layer basically performs business logic. And then you have the data layer, which basically interacts with any data source. So let's start with the presentational layer. So as I said, you have a client where it sends a request to your application, and this basically can be an API. Most likely will be an API, because these days you don't bundle things together with the backend. So you have a RESTful API, or it could be a GraphQL API, any other type of APIs. And the main job of it is to produce something. So in our case, if it's an API, then it will produce maybe some JSON or XML or any data format that you want, but most likely it will be some JSON, or it can even be HTML. So it's very simple, and it does nothing, right? So it just takes a request from the clients, and usually you expose a bunch of endpoints, so using HTTP semantics, so post, get, put, delete, and whatnot. Then the presentational layer forwards the request to the business layer. Now this layer right here, so it takes an input, and usually this could be like a DTO, for example. So let's say person DTO, right? And then the input comes from the presentational layer, and the business layer is pretty much the business logic. So if you take, for example, customers, right? You want to register a customer. So you want to make sure that the email, for example, is not taken. You want to make sure that the client has provided the right email, right name, or maybe the name is not empty, or you want to check whether you accept a certain age, for example, right? So you perform all validation that you want. Okay. Now here you can see that we've got classes. So basically within the business layer, you can have one or more classes talking to each other. Maybe you have one class that performs email validation. You have another class that performs phone number validations. And this is the main class for the whatever entity that you are working with. And then depending, sometimes it might not always give you an output. So you have an input and an output, right? So then we have the data layer right here. And in here, I'm saying clients. So clients really are, pretty much all the other classes that wish to consume some data. So this right here, sometimes you'll hear people saying that this is the DAO, data access object. And you can see that here I've got two data sources, so Postgres as well as MySQL. And often this is an interface. And let me know if you want me to record a video on how to put this together the right way. But basically, this is an interface where you basically define the contract and then you have one implementation. So in my case, I've got Postgres. Now, Postgres might be one implementation, but let's say that you want to change from Postgres to MySQL. Now, if you have the interface, then it's easy for you to make that change. So I've made a video on solid principles a while ago, which I definitely recommend you to go and check. So basically, this is the idea of the N-tier architecture. So the idea is that you have separation of concerns. So again, solid. One layer should do one thing and do it well. So the presentation layer takes requests, forwards to the business logic performs, or actually forwards to the business layer performs business logic, any kind of validation, and then if it needs to access some data, it talks to the data layer, and this is pretty much it. When it comes to testing though, it's a little bit different. So for testing the presentation layer, so if we have an API, for example, we need to write integration tests. Now here, we're not testing the method itself, but we are testing the HTTP semantics, meaning that the actual post request that a client would actually send, for example, for example, if it's a GET, then we test the actual GET request. And I'll show you this in a second. I've got a really nice example for you. Then we have the business layer. So here, this is mainly unit testing and mocking. Yeah. So in cases where you've got multiple service classes talking to each other, then if you test one class, you don't want to test it again when it's being used in a different class. Then you have the data layer in here, where you kind of just want to test, basically, you do some unit testing on the database queries. Okay, so here maybe you want to use test containers, for example. You get a database up and running with Postgres, and then you test all of your SQL code, for example. Or maybe if it's a MongoDB, if you have a query which is complex, then you test that query itself. And this is pretty much it. Now, let me give you an example. Cool. In here, I do have this full stack application, which is part of my brand new course. And I'm going to release it in about, I think 14 days or so. And there's a waiting list for it. So I definitely recommend you to learn how to build something like this. And this will take you from beginner all the way to professional. So this right here is deployed within AWS. So you can see the URL in here, and feel free to use it, but please try not to break it. So if I try and log in here, you can see that I've got bad credentials, and I've done that on purpose. But you can see that the business layer is performing some kind of validation and saying, hey, you've provided the wrong password. So if I log in, then you can see that I'm inside, and this is it, right? So I can basically check the customers that I currently have, and you can see that I've got a few customers in here, and I can delete a customer if I want, or if I want to create a new customer. So if I say create new customer, and let's say that we want to have, for example, foo and then bar, and the email will be, let's say, amplify, or actually, email here, amplify at, and then amigoscode.com, and age 22. Let's just pick a random password, for example. So random password, select the gender, and now I can submit. Now, if I submit this, this will say email taken. So you can see that the validation has kicked in, right? So this is basically what I was showing you within the diagrams. So let me actually show you some code so that all of this makes sense. In here, I'm within IntelliJ, and if we look into the customer package, so basically here, this is how we divide things into layers. So the presentational layer is the controller. So this is Java World, Spring Boot. So often this will be the controller itself. You can see here, this is a REST controller. This is the mapping API v1 customers. And if you look into this right here, so all I'm doing is get customers. I'm just forwarding the request to the service class because service class is responsible for business logic. So let's say register a customer. So all I'm doing is I'm basically sending the request to the service class, add and then customer, right? Have a look in here, delete customer. I call the service and then delete. Update, I call the service and then update. Now here, basically, this is using dependency injection. So this is how you connect the layers together. So if we look into customer service in here, you can see that this basically has the DAO. So basically the service connects to the DAO. And you can see that basically here, then we can choose depending on an implementation that we want. But have a look, the service, for example, when it gets all customers, it says, right, DAO, the data access object, right? So the data layer, give me customers, please. And then it does some transformation, right? The same with get customer. So here, select customer by ID. If it doesn't exist, then throw an exception. And you can see that this is business logic. The same with adding a customer. The first thing I check is whether the email was taken. If it's taken, throw an exception. And this is what you just saw within the UI. Then if it's not the case, then we want to add the customer. Same for delete. If it's not there, then throw an exception. Update a customer. Only update fields that have changes in it. Have a look. So you can see that it's quite long, this method. Then if we look into the DAO itself, so here, this is an interface. And if I show you the implementations, you can see that I've got 3 implementations, which means I can choose the implementations as needed without breaking anything. So here I've got JDBC, and you can see that here, this is some SQL. And the other implementation is, so if I click on the eye icon in there, so we have JPA, and have a look. JPA is quite simple, to be honest, right? And then we also have one, which is a fake one, which basically just has like a static list. And to be honest, this is the entire architecture in action. And one thing that I forgot to show you is, so within the service layer, so customer service, you can see that here I've got access to password encoder, for example. So this performs encoding on the password. Customer DTO mapper. So this is another class that basically performs transformations. Okay. Now, one thing to bear in mind is, so if I go back to the top, so you saw that this is the annotation for REST controller, so the presentational layer. So here we are building a RESTful API. So if we look into the customer service, you see that there's an appropriate annotation for it. So this is at and then service, right? And basically this is to do with dependency injection. And if we look into the DAO as well, so DAO in here, so this is the interface, which doesn't need any annotation. But if we look into, let's say, customer and then JDBC, you can see that at repository. And then we give it a name and off it goes to perform stuff with the database. So in this case, it's Postgres. Now, the last thing that I want to show you is testing. So testing is very important, okay? So if we look into, so let's start from the DAO itself. So let's just take this customer JDBC data access service. So this guy right here, so we have tests and you should always test your code, okay? So here, let's go into this test, and you'll see that basically all I'm doing is I'm extending abstract test containers. So here I'm getting an instance of Postgres that I can run these SQL commands. So if I go back to the under test class, so select, and then where, insert, select count, delete. So all of these, I want to test them. So that's why I'm bringing a database, a real database, so Postgres, that I can test my code, right? So here, select all customers, and you can see that this is pure unit testing, okay? Now, let's look into customer and then service. So customer service depends on customer DAO. So remember, I told you that the service class, it's mainly unit testing and mocking. So if we look into the test for this in here, you can see that we have a bunch of mocks. Have a look. So a bunch of mocks. And when I set up the under test class, you can see that I pass all the mocks. And then basically you can see this is just mocking when necessary, okay? Because we don't want to basically test the exact same functionality that we did test within the DAO, for example, because there's no point. We fully tested it. Now, when we test in other places, we could just mock it. And remember, unit tests, they must be fast. So if you're bringing the real implementations, that is wrong. So I'll show you when to do that in a second. Cool. So then you can see that this is a bunch of mocking, testing exceptions and whatnot. Then for integration tests, so here, so the controller itself, right? API v1. So here, so many people will test basically this as a unit test and then invoke this method altogether. But this is wrong. What you want to do is you want to write an integration test where you test the HTTP semantics in here: get, post, delete, put, so on and so forth. So if I go to, I think I do have a folder called test in here, and within test I've got journey, and have a look, authentication, IT, and customer IT. So this is anything related with customer. So can register a customer. So we set up some code, and then here we send a post request. Have a look. So here, web test client, post. So here, we're not even getting access to the class itself. So here, we're not doing this. So we're not doing customer controller equals to new customer controller, and then customer controller dot, and you can see that we can register. So this is incorrect. So what you want to do is you want to test the post semantic, so HTTP semantic. And for integration tests, you actually spin up the entire application, whereas for unit testing, you don't. Okay, now let me show you an example. So basically, let's just run all the unit tests for customer, for example. So you should see that these tests will be super quick. So just wait a second, and you can see that everything that has to do with mocking, it's quick. But for repositories here, I'm testing against a real database, and you can see that 38 tests passed. If we look into integration tests, so here, this is actually testing against our application, so the running application. So if I run this, so we actually have the customer as well as authentication, and you can see that these tests, they're running, and you can see the actual SQL. So have a look actually. So if I show you the logs, so you can see that we set up the data source and migrations, and have a look. Tomcat started on port. So this is a random port that we use because at the end of it, the process just dies, right? So this is pretty much it. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, do so. And also, if you haven't joined the waiting list, go ahead and join, because this course that's about to come out very soon, it's over 40 hours, and it will teach you all of this that you see here from the ground up, including deployment, backend, front end, DevOps, and the whole shebang. This is pretty much it. comment down below and let me know what other content that you want to see next. I'll catch you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.